Good morning, eighth grade. It is probably February 1st when I'm posting this. It is, as you can see down here at the bottom, Friday the 29th. I'm recording this. It's 8 o'clock here. I just got to work at school, got an 8:30 meeting, so this won't be a super long presentation. I also will try to get 8-4 recorded today, so you don't have to go without a video like we did with 8-2. Sorry about that. I just didn't have my time planned very well. It's not that it's not that I feel like you need to see my giant shiny. I just shaved it, so shiny head in the corner. But I do think that when I could give you a little bit of a guidance and context, specifically about what's going to be on the test whenever I'm doing this on video rather than just sending you the notes. I do feel like it's better for you learning the actual information that you need to, and I want you to, and the state says you have to learn. And so that's why I like to do these videos. Not that I feel like I need to get my YouTube subscribers up or whatever, but I do feel like it helps, which is why you're subjected to seeing my scraggly rat's nest beard in the corner. So today we're talking about the Spanish-American War, and basically, it's a really wild thing that is not just doesn't just apply to this specific war. There's the Mexican-American War where we got basically the long version is that these are huge earth-altering events, specifically when you consider from the angle of the other country, Cuba in this instance, or Spain, if you want to consider what you would say their mother country is. This is one of the biggest, most talked about events in the history of their island. And for us, it is one, not even full section of one chapter in our textbook, and we just kind of gloss over it. And it just really hammers the point home to me that, history that you live in the moment and how it goes down in the history books are not always the same thing. And that's why it's important to, notice things while they're happening so you don't let your important events become a footnote. But anyway, Cuba, we didn't really get to talk about it a lot last year because of quarantine, and because after the Constitution test, when we get into the early days of the actual American nation. But the idea is that once America declared its independence from Great Britain, and once we have won our independence from Great Britain, this basically sets off a domino effect of other countries that look around at what happened in America, and they say to themselves, well, why can't we have that here? The colonization, imperialization is a big thing around the world. When you think about the languages that are spoken in North America, they are generally not native to North American. We, of course, speak English because we were mostly colonized by England, of course. But, of course, when you think of Central and South America, you think mostly of Spanish, and that is because they were colonized by Spain, of course, the big exception being the largest South American nation of Brazil, which speaks and was colonized by the Portuguese. But anyway, Spain had seen our success in gaining our independence, and they had seen the French Revolution, which is a whole other thing, and one of the biggest, most talked about events of world history. And we can't, this is, as an American history class, we don't really get into that, but things got nuts over there. And so they had rebelled several times by the late 1800s. Each time Spain sends in its forces, crushes the rebellion, and retains control over the island of Cuba. But in 1895, under the leadership of a man named Jose Marti, Cuban forces revolted. Thousands of Cuban civilians died from starvation and disease during the conflict. But Americans mostly had been hands off until we realized that our money could be messed with by this going on in Cuba. And so American businessmen are worried about the loss of their money, and that's something in America that you never want to mess with. Same for Hawaii in the last section. We talked about the idea that we were going to spread religion through missionary work in Hawaii, and that's what brought a lot of Hawaiians into contact with white Americans. But the reality is, it wasn't until the sugarcane farms were being threatened that we actually stepped in, and we didn't have to fight a war there because Liliuokalani stepped aside to prevent the loss of life. But Americans get war fever. Basically, another time in your vocab, yellow journalism is going to be a vocab word. Yellow journalism is this is the example it's talking about here is basically they really exaggerated headlines to try to bring readers in, but what it really did was stir the pot to get Americans, as you can see, all frothed up and ready to fight a war. And so government officials hoped to remain neutral. That was at a time in American history where the idea of going to war and paying the price and loss of American lives was something that weighed heavily on elected officials. Now we've been in war every day since 2003, with no indication that either party wants to bring our troops home. So President McKinley sends the battleship Maine to Havana Harbor, and it's there for 3 weeks, and it done blowed up. It explodes, and 260 American officers and crew members are killed. In Spain, and the newspapers immediately blame Spain. You blew up our battleship, B5 or whatever, playing that board game. And so this was the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say. This was a bridge too far. Americans were already yearning to go to war with Spain in Cuba to declare Cuban independence. But Spain blowing up the American battleship, the Maine, was, like I said, the last straw. The punchline here, of course, is we later found out it was almost certainly a electrical accidental explosion. But the toothpaste was already out of the tube. We were already at war. We can't really be like, well, sorry about those, people we shot and stabbed, are bad. And so cat's out of the bag, toothpaste is out of the tube, as they say. And so on April 25th, 1898, and like I said, this is before we found out it was an accident, we declared war on Spain. The first military actions of the war took place in the islands of the Philippines. We helped Filipino rebels led by Emilio Aguinaldo. And basically, they thought that they would gain independence and then we would stay there to support them, but we really didn't. Also, I do want to point out that yes, Philippines is spelled like that, but yes, Filipino, meaning a person from the Philippines, is spelled with an F instead of a PH, and I don't know why they do it like that. And yes, I do think it's weird and dumb also, but I'm not the Earth's spelling emperor yet. It's right up there with Colonel being spelled with no R's as one of the dumbest things. Eventually, though, America really didn't stay and support the Filipinos as they expected us to, as they had every reason to believe that we would, because we had helped them fight to gain their independence. Emilio Aguinaldo is going to become very upset with Americans, and we'll see him a little bit later. So now we move on to Cuba, and we block their fleet in the Santiago, which is the biggest Cuban city in their harbor. Havana is their biggest city. Santiago is their second biggest city, I should say. But anyway, a combined force of Cuban and American soldiers were able to drive back the most famous American fighting force in the Spanish-American War in Cuba were called the Rough Riders, and they were led by future President Teddy Roosevelt. Again, this is a little bit before, he became president in the last chapter, but we've gone back in time a little bit. The famous story, I don't know if I said it on a video last time, but he was Undersecretary of the Navy. He had a very important desk job in the armed forces when this war broke out. And he was like, yes, so a war, because Teddy Roosevelt was basically a crazy guy that was ready to fight at a drop of a hat. And when the war broke out, he was really excited to go join, but the people in charge were like, Teddy, no, you can't do that. You have a very important desk job. You're important to the infrastructure of America. We can't have our undersecretaries of Navy out there fighting. He's like, you're right. That's a good point. So I quit. So he quit his job to be able to go fight, and led one of the most famous battalions of troops in the history of world anywhere. The Rough Riders are well known, pretty much worldwide. So we destroyed the Spanish fleet, and so the Spain after we captured Cuba and then Puerto Rico, the Spanish signed an armistice. An armistice is not a treaty. An armistice is like one country says, "You win. Stop. Let's stop shooting while we work on a treaty." Okay, an armistice is a temporary stop to shooting while a permanent treaty is worked on. The war lasted less than 4 months, and only about 400 Americans were killed in battle. And so this is why you saw the quote on a slide earlier. Some politicians call it a splendid little war. I feel that's cheap and minimizing. I mean, sure, it's good overall in the grand scheme of things that only 400 Americans died in this war. That does minimize the loss of the life of those 400 people. It's not, you could say, oh, only 400, cool. But to the families of those 400 men, that doesn't really ring true. And so, I don't know. I've always felt icky about saying that, like, oh, this was a great war. Everything went well, like, well, that's not true. That's before you mention all the thousands of Spanish and Cuban troops that lost their lives. They count too. And, we can, a lot of times we like to think of war as good guy, bad guy. And then when we kill a troop from another country, that's a good thing. And in some cases, that's true. You think of the Nazis, killing a Nazi in World War II, that's a net positive for planet Earth for sure. But when you're talking about a lot of these issues, these are just poor 18-year-old kids who needed a job, and the Army was the only thing there. And they're not really always behind the driving force behind the cause that they're fighting for. Their loss of life could be a tragedy, just like the loss of life of American troops. The famous saying is always "rich man's war and a poor man's fight," and that's very true in a lot of cases. That's before you get into the fact that there are a lot of people in these that die just living in their houses, not even involved in the military, just trying to enjoy their dinner, and they're called collateral damage. And so the idea of like, oh, it was cool, we only killed this many people, I feel like that's really minimizing to the value of those lives. But your mileage may vary on that. Losing 400 men is better than losing 4,000. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying, I don't feel like it's fair to minimize their lives either. African American soldiers, as always, are being discriminated against in the American Armed Forces. We've fixed a lot of that. We still have a ways to go, but they are being placed in segregated units. They're usually the first ones sent in to draw the heaviest fire. Again, it's a shameful practice. We signed a treaty in December of 1898. Cuba became a protectorate of the United States. If you know anything about Cuba, that did not last. They became communist in the 1900s and became our enemy for a great number of decades. We are on a little bit better terms now, but we'll see how that goes. We just have a new presidential administration, so we'll see how that changes that. Guam and Puerto Rico became U.S. territories. Those are that's still true. Spain also surrendered the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. That's a problem because we helped Spain fight. We helped Spain fight. Nope. Take 3. We helped the Philippines fight for independence from Spain. Sorry about that. I would just edit that out, but that's going to take time that I don't have. So you just have to deal with my weird misspeaking efforts, just like you would if I was in class. So there is an editing tool on this software, but yeah, not worth the time. But anyway, we helped the Philippines gain independence from Spain, and then they were like, we're going to help you become independent. And then they were like, yay. And then they won the war, and then we're like, just kidding, you're ours now, and just instead of theirs. They're like, well, that's not any better. And so there were hard feelings for reasons that are pretty easy to understand. Cuba granted full independence in 1901, but only after they gave us certain rights. And again, that's going to cause bad blood when they become communists later on down the road. They're not allowed to make treaties with other countries. We gain control at the naval base of Guantanamo Bay, which is still very American and very famous for very shameful reasons. That is where we set up our international torture program. The U.S. would intervene if the country's independence was threatened. Again, this has not worked out in the long run. So in Aguinaldo, the guy that we fought with, is now angry with us, as promised earlier, and he leads an attack on the Americans. Their goal was independence. That says A, acquiring up there at the top. Their goal was independence, not American colonization instead of Spanish colonization. That's just trading out one master for another. But eventually we got some progressive presidents. We talked about in the last chapter, Roosevelt and Taft, and they acquiesced and let the Philippines gain their own independence. And by 1946, they were their own country. So that's it for today. The Google form question is just I don't know. What do you think? Just favorite food. Like I said, you've answered that before. What's your favorite food? If you had one meal, what would you eat for your last meal? If you had the choice of anything on earth, let me know in the Google form. That counts as you being in class for the day. Otherwise, masks, hand washing. Hopefully, some people are starting to get shots. I've got one. I've got another one coming up. Not next. Well, that calendar is not even on the right month right now. So today, it'll be 2 weeks from Thursday. So hopefully I'll be vaccinated by then. You don't care. But anyway, have a great rest of the day. I will talk to you later.